Hello, cell biology fans. I'm Dr. Stein, and this is our first lecture of the class, and I am just happy to have you all. And I want you to know that I'm here to help you do the best you can in this class. It's a really fun class for me. I love cell biology, and I hope that I can instill in you the passion I have for this, because I think it's incredible how complex and functional we are on a day-to-day basis. So I just want to go over the syllabus just really briefly, then we'll talk about the tree of life and what life is, and then discuss prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms a little bit. With respect to books, students always ask me, should I buy the book? And my answer to that is, if you're going to read the book, then you probably should buy the book. Most students don't want to read the book, and I know that chapters are really long, so I will give you an old version, like a really old version of Molecular Biology of the Cell, the text from it, but a lot of it hasn't changed. A lot of what we're going to talk about are the basics of cell biology. When there's things that are different, I will point them out, but no need to purchase the book. Just use what I've provided. It's on the syllabus, as well as it should be in Canvas as well. I'm going to remove this slide because we don't need it. Most of the class will be flipped, right? Which means you're going to watch videos at home, you're going to take notes on the videos, you're going to study the material, you're going to look up information in the book that you don't understand, and from there, right, we're going to go into doing uploads, we're going to do quizzes, we're going to do everything we can to get you prepared to take exams that will determine your grades for the class, okay? We do have a peer learning facilitator for this class. This is somebody who has taken the class and done quite well, earning an A. So Keenan is our PLF, and she will be in charge of your grade for the PLF. That being said, you can see that your quizzes cost an awful lot with respect to how much they're counted into your grade. So if you don't take the PLF, so no PLF, means quizzes will count 25% of your grade. Whereas if you take the PLF, quizzes will only count 20%, and that other 5% will go towards your PLF grade. Because we're online, we're also going to have to do things a little bit differently, because it used to be for the PLF, if you just came and attended and participated in the PLF session, you receive full credit for it. Since we aren't really attending anything these days, we'll figure out how to get you a grade for that. Perhaps all of the things that you do for that class will add up, and maybe we see that you participate every week. That will give you your grade. Keenan will be in charge of this, so I do recommend using PLF. Keenan is really smart. Keenan knows what I am interested in and the things that I likely will ask you on exams. So taking advantage of Keenan is the right thing to do here. I wouldn't say that normally, but in this case, sign up for PILF if you want to, and if not, don't. It's no longer a Google Doc. It's actually something called Sign Up Genus. Sign Up. And the link is in your on the Canvas top module. All right, with that, we're ready to start. And you know, the first question really is, what is cell biology? And if you get right down to it, what is biology? I think most of you know, right? The ology part of cell biology means to study. And the bio part is the important part for us, right? What are we studying? We're studying bio, and bio means life. Okay, well, great, we're studying life. What does life mean? And what does it mean with respect to living organisms? And in many, 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 many books, they will give you a list that's longer than 5 items. But I want you to know 5 major things that are important. All right? So let's start with all living organisms are made of cells. All right? So all living organisms are made of cells. And you don't really even need to know what cells are, but right, we will learn what cells are. So what organism doesn't really fall into this, right? So viruses are not considered alive, so not living. And they're considered not living because of what? Well, they need a host cell in order to replicate. So right away, that gives us a hint. So all living organisms, So all living organisms must be able to replicate. And I'm going to use the word replicate, or what's my other choice? I think we'll go with replicate or reproduce. You know, the first one of these, this idea about cells being, you know, the smallest unit of life, is really an important feature, and that came from the original cell theory. This idea to replicate or reproduce, right, means that you as an organism have to have all of the machinery required to make new ewes. No, you know, I don't really want new Mary Pats, but you know, if you want to have children, right, we do it by sexual reproduction. But sexual reproduction isn't the only way to reproduce. You can reproduce asexually or sexually. I'm just going to leave it at replicate and reproduce. So those are 2 of the features of living organisms. What are the rest? Well, all living organisms have heritable material. And I'm going to make you say heritable. And what does heritable means? You can inherit things. These are passed down from generation to generation. So you inherit this material. And the material for us, right, is DNA. But remember, back when life began, we really do think that it was an RNA, quote-unquote, world. And that the heritable material when we started out was an RNA molecule. Okay, so now we have 3. Number 4. So all living organisms utilize energy. And when I say utilize energy, it's important that you don't say they don't make energy, right? Because energy can neither be made or destroyed. They just utilize energy to be alive. And for us, right, we're really talking about our metabolism and our ability to convert one form of energy into another. And in particular, right, what is the energy that we really need? We need ATP. And so converting energy from one form to another and using ATP as our energy source in the body and in cells. All right, we have 4. Okay, and the way I remember this, I just use acronyms. So CHEER. So we have cells, heritable material, utilize energy, reproduce or replicate, and then I'm missing the last one. It's funny, I always forget this one. All living organisms evolve. Right? So we learned that Darwin and all the other people who did it at the same time. Wallace, we learned that all living organisms evolve, and that we, right, most of our evolution is based on survival of the fittest. So this means that we change our DNA in order to survive. And that evolution, right, has allowed us to become who we are. So evolving and survival of the species. And as a species, right, human beings, right, we're probably going to evolve, right, and individuals can't evolve, but the human species can evolve. Probably after this pandemic, many people will evolve to be resistant, right? And does that mean that down the road their children will be resistant? Not necessarily, but it's possible that something could happen along those lines over the course of time. Probably we're talking millions and millions of years. So those are the 5 features that all living organisms display that you need to know. When we look at the beginnings of life on Earth, and notice this is a pretty old slide, right, from 2005, but I like this one best because it really demonstrates to me, right, so Earth began over here. Let's use red, I think would be good. So Earth began, let's say, at midnight. And the origin of Earth really came about when the Big Bang Theory occurred and the stars and everything in the universe exploded. And then as the dust settled, little bits of dust started to aggregate together, and that formed into the planets. So that was approximately 5.5 million years ago. And if you see, the first life form shows up not for, right, so how long did it take? It took, I don't know, a little over 1 million years for life to evolve on the planet Earth. And that first living organism, we don't know what it is, right? We just know that that is the beginning of life. And life, as we just defined it, there had to have been a cell, there had to have been heritable material. This organism that evolved used energy, it evolved, and it also was able to replicate. So life, whatever that was, evolved until, right, we get to bacteria, and different kinds of bacteria evolve, cyanobacteria, photosynthetic bacteria. We go through here, right, and you see we get, so all of this is the development and evolution of prokaryotes. And then somewhere around 2 million years ago, eukaryotes began. And so we split, and then you see higher ordered organisms, algae, invertebrates, plants, mammals, and humans are literally that little tiny thing 1 minute before midnight. So we haven't really been around all that long as far as humans go, but obviously life has been on this planet for, 4 million years, and we've been evolving into who we are today. Aren't we wonderful? The tree of life is something that every biology student should know and understand, and this is a relatively old picture again, but I want to point out, right, we have this common ancestor, and that was the original life form. So a cell that most likely had RNA, and we see that the very earliest organisms are here. Let me see, I can't even circle. Right, those are early organisms, and all of these guys in the middle here. And what that means is we have prokaryotes in both eubacteria and archaebacteria. Those are both considered prokaryotes. And that was before this particular division occurred, and that led to the evolution of eukaryotes. Remember, humans are way out here on the very end. We haven't been around very long. And it'll be interesting to see, is there something that evolves off of humans? Who knows? We could become two different species at some point in time. I doubt I'll be around for that. So what do you need to know about the tree of life? What are the differences in these branches? I'd like you to at least know that there's, right, the original ancestor. We know we have prokaryotes, we have both eubacteria as well as archaebacteria, and then we have eukaryotes over here. So just a simple drawing demonstrating that you understand what the tree of life looks like. How do we actually know that we're different than other organisms is a pretty simple question. We look at them. That was the simplest way, and back in the day, right, they determined, right, oh, you could either move or you could not move. And it's interesting because things that moved they said were alive versus not moving was not alive, which makes no sense. We know now, right, lots of plants don't move, although they actually do move. But the easiest way is to look at things, and that was what olden times, right? So over the course of time, we've had lots and lots of ways to determine how these differences were determined. And this particular tree of life was determined based on a guy named Carl Woese, W-O-E-S-E. And what Carl Woese looked at was rRNA in the genomes of tons and tons of different organisms. And what is rRNA? Well, rRNA is pretty simple to understand. It's ribosomal RNA. Okay, well, great. We know RNA is a heritable material. Why are we looking at ribosomal RNA? Well, so over time, lots of people were looking at different DNAs, different RNAs, and it was demonstrated that ribosomal RNA is pretty well conserved. Pretty well conserved. And what does that mean? It means it didn't change all that much from organism to organism. And so what Carl did was, by the time he came around, when he started looking at different organisms, let me just make this bigger, right? It doesn't matter what these organisms are, but you can see that the ribosomal RNA that they were comparing, right? The first one is all the same, the second one, all of the blue are similarities, and then you have differences. So for this first one, so if we just stopped right there, you could say, oh, all of these organisms are related, and that this one and this one evolved potentially from the other ones. It's hard to say which one came first, but the fact that you see it more frequently, the A's in this position. And you continue doing that across an entire ribosomal RNA, and that allowed Woese to generate the map that we just saw, the tree of life that we just saw. On the bottom here, I've also included a different map, right? And this is actually looking at these different organisms. And, this is another way to do a tree and look at the relationships. So you see that you have a split here. And so these guys are all going to be more similar to one another than they would be to the ones on the bottom. Because the difference, right, where the differences are, makes a difference, the length of the lines. So I would ask you to be able to understand how you can compare RNAs to see who is more similar to one another than not. And this is something that you might practice in your PLF session. So here's a practice question you could do. And literally what you do is you compare number 1. So we look at number 1 and we compare it to number 2. And we say, Same, 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 same. Wow, it looks like this is going to be exactly the same organism. Oh, when will the same stop? T. Oh, there we go. Right? We have a C for a G, right? And that's the first change we see. Well, do we see the same kind of thing when we look at organism 1 to organism 2? So we look at A, T, G, G, T. Oh, and for this one, right, we have the T and the A. And you would do this all the way through the gene, and you say how many different are each of them, and could you put them in some sort of order? All right, so I'll let Keenan work with you on that. So the main thing that I wanted you to get from the tree of life was prokaryotes being the archaebacteria and the eubacteria, and eukaryotes being pretty much us. So let's talk about what do the words prokaryote and eukaryote mean? Where did they come from? So karyo, all right, we see this word used a lot in biology, all right, and karyo comes from the word in Greek for kernel. And I always like to think of this because when we talk about prokaryotes, all right, what does the word pro mean? Pro means before. So when we say prokaryote, we're talking about before there was a kernel. And for the purposes of this, if you think about a cell, all right, and I draw that inside the cell, what do you immediately say? Oh, that's the nucleus. Well, turns out that's the kernel. So prokaryotes do not have a nucleus. So this is a eukaryote. Right? It has a kernel, and U means true. Okay? This is an exercise that you should do. Okay? This shows up on exams, and you should be able to compare and contrast what is the same, what are different. And you'll see at the end of the slides there is a comparison, but as we talk about prokaryotes and eukaryotes, this is what I want you to be thinking about. And for an exam, how might I ask these kinds of questions? Tell me 3 things that are similar between eukaryotes and prokaryotes as part of their cellular makeup. Okay? And so the things that I'm going to talk about now would be the kinds of answers that I want you to give me for that kind of question. Here is a typical prokaryote, and what it's doing is, what we're doing here is just demonstrating that this is a cell, right? So most important, if it's a living organism, it has to be a cell. This is a cell that has many of the same things that we have. Okay, I'm going to go back and use red. So cytoplasm, we have cytoplasm for sure. So both prokaryotes and eukaryotes have cytoplasms. Flagella is an interesting one because this particular bacteria has a flagella, and we know that some human cells have flagella. So that can be a similarity. It could also be a difference, and I'll explain that in a moment. Okay, let's see. There is a membrane, cell membrane, and so all cells have a cell membrane. We do know, right, that some bacteria have cell walls and capsules. And okay, maybe I should use I'll use an asterisk. So cell membranes, cytoplasm, flagella. I would say they are truly in every single cell. Not all cells have a cell wall. Not all cells have a capsule. Generally, capsule is only for bacteria. All right, another thing that we have in common, ribosomes. So there are ribosomes in prokaryotes, but there are also ribosomes in eukaryotes. And what else is on this image? This image shows, right, a nucleoid. And that is different, right? That is different than what we have in in eukaryotes. In eukaryotes, we have the nucleus. All right, well, what else is on our list? So the nucleoid is where prokaryotes have their DNA, ribosomes, cell membrane, flagella. Pili are these little appendages or little membrane covered things that stick out of the cell, and they actually are for testing the environment. Cell wall and capsule are usually there for protection and to maintain the cell's structure. In contrast, what you see here is a prokaryotic cell, and for eukaryotic cell, and what you see instead of sort of a big empty space is lots of things in there. So you can see there's a nucleus, and that is a membrane-bound nucleus. Eukaryotes have membrane-bound organelles. That's really important. And you should know that if you say membrane-bound organelles, the nucleus is an organelle. So don't say they have a nucleus and then say they have membrane-bound organelles, because that's the same answer. Okay? So you could say they have a nucleus, they have mitochondria, etc. But, right, membrane-bound organelles is really one answer. So either nucleus or membrane-bound organelles would be one answer. The number one answer that you should give me, if you know the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, the presence of a nucleus. That's number one. What else do you see in here? Well, there's lots of stuff in here. And like I said, there's things that we have in common, right? Ribosomes are in common. Cytosol, which I'm not sure is shown on here, but you know, there's cytosol, and that's similar. Cell membrane, where do they point to the cell membrane? No idea. So we'll do our own cell membrane. What else do we have? Some sort of heritable material inside the nucleus. So, right, DNA. They use the word chromatin here. Chromatin means DNA that has proteins on it. All right. So lots of differences, lots of things the same, and those are things that you want to be able to point out. This is also eukaryotic cell. I put it up here because everybody wants to say, oh, cell walls are in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Only some eukaryotes have a cell wall. Obviously, plants have a cell wall, and we know that that's important for their structure. They also have a vacuole, something, right, that we don't have. Although it's funny, we have vacuoles in many, many different kinds of cells, but this is a big central vacuole that's used for storage, right? And the other big difference, chloroplasts. And chloroplasts are all about photosynthesis. So this is all about being able to capture the energy from the sun and convert it into a form that the plant can use. Okay? So those were cartoon images. This is an EM image. And when we look at EM images, okay, which stands for electron micrograph, which is basically a picture. This image is taken by bombarding a cell with electrons, and the electrons will go through some places, and then some places they don't go through because there's too much mass there, too much. It can't get past hitting things and getting deflected. So where you see light, right, light spaces, those are called electron lucent, which means light, all right, versus electron dense, which means the electron couldn't get through, so we don't see it. We don't see that area. And I'm going to put a little, I mean, this is not perfect, and it's kind of all over the place, right? So what is all this electron lucent area? In prokaryotes, that is most likely the nucleoid. And it's electron lucent because it is very small. There are not a ton of things that the electrons will hit. And that's different than in proteins. And a lot of that has to do with how the cells are treated prior to being put in front of the electron micrograph. But so this is the nucleoid, and I hope you can see the cell membrane. It's pretty clear, right? And I like this picture because if I blow it up, right, we can really look at the cell membrane, and it's amazing to me, right? So there's this line, and then there's this space in between. So what does that mean? Well, that's something that we can learn and understand because of how the cells are treated prior to being put in an electron microscope, and we'll talk more about that later. Okay? All right. So for prokaryotes, a lot of people, right, they are small. They're 10 times smaller than eukaryotes, and they appear simple. Simple is, when you have to learn about how a prokaryote works, they're not simple at all. Many times, right, prokaryotes live as single cells, but they can then form into larger multicellular masses that, right, biofilms is where the cells interact with one another, and that does play a role in their life. That tough outer coat called the cell wall is usually there for protection, and that's probably what I've drawn this arrow to down below. And inside is probably a cell membrane, and we have the cytoplasmic compartment, and then what is all this dark stuff? That dark stuff is all of the machinery, the proteins inside that prokaryote that are required for that prokaryote to live. Once again, back to the cartoon, right? The nucleoid, which I circled in the last one, right, is shown here. And what's interesting is that we think that the DNA that's found in prokaryotes, which we call the nucleoid, is naked DNA, meaning it doesn't have tons of proteins bound to it, so no proteins. And that's very different than in eukaryotes, where I think I showed you it said chromatin. And chromatin is DNA that's covered in proteins, histones in particular. So we have chromatin, whereas they have naked DNA. So there's a difference. Now, you guys know a lot about DNA, I think. You probably already done a lot of cell biology. There is another difference between the DNA in prokaryotes versus the DNA in eukaryotes. Most prokaryotes have a single circular chromosome. So one chromosome. Here's a chromosome that's circular. And why am I drawing double? Well, it's still double-stranded DNA, okay? So even though it's just a single chromosome, it's still double-stranded DNA, and this is all they need for being a living organism, and this is the heritable material that they have in their nucleoid. Okay. Eukaryotes, as I already said, the U means true, so a true kernel, and I always think kernel like a kernel of corn, right? Here's my cell. Ironic that right? There's my kernel of corn, right? My kernel of corn is the nucleus. And to be honest with you, that's not the right way to draw a nucleus, but for the purposes of this, you understand what I'm saying. When I draw a cell, usually the first thing that people put in the cell is the nucleus. All right, and the nucleus is a membrane-bound organelle. Big difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes is that nucleus. And what you want to think about is, why did we evolve to have a separate internal compartment where we stored our DNA? Why do we have to do that? And if you think about the evolution of organisms, we get more and more and more and more complex. And the idea, we think, is that we evolved to have different activities going on in different membrane-bound organelles. And that became more efficient than the process that occurs in prokaryotes. And I'm not really sure it's more efficient, but it is what we did. We have become more compartmentalized, and we definitely separate different processes in the cell, whereas in prokaryotes they do everything mostly in the cytoplasm. Okay. It's interesting, so eukaryotes are almost always single-celled organisms, which we don't think of it like that, but there are tons of protists, which are single-celled organisms, but eukaryotes can form multicellular organisms like us. Yay for us. So if I'm giving you differences, right, prokaryotes are smaller, which means eukaryotes are bigger and more complex. This is an interesting one. For a long time, we did not think that prokaryotes had any cytoskeleton. That may be changing. There may actually be some sort of cytoskeletal filaments in prokaryotes that we previously were missing. So I wouldn't really count this one, okay? I might even just cross that one off. And we have different organelles. Here's a bunch of, right, eukaryotes are very complicated, right? Protists are generally single-celled organisms, and I'm showing you one of these called a diatom over here. I love diatoms. They're just beautiful. Look at the image. I just think that's fantastic, right? Then we have fungi, right? This is a fungi here. This is a plant cell, a stomata cell, and that allows for the intake of carbon dioxide into cells. So it goes through the stomata into the cell to enable plant cells to make sugars. Yeast cells are eukaryotic, and right, so it's a budding yeast, so you can see this little bud coming off. All right, and finally, right, we have breast cancer cells. We have all the cells in our body that are all eukaryotic, so mammalian cells. So the universal features of cells that I told you needed to know, right? Remember the acronym, CHEER. So hereditary information, right, which we find in DNA, right? That template DNA, right, is what allows you to make little u's. And notice, right, because we do sexual reproduction, sometimes you come out just looking like your parents, and sometimes you're completely different than your parents. So that's kind of cool. It's interesting, all cells have DNA and copy it into RNA in the process called transcription. And all cells, both prokaryotic and eukaryotic, translate RNA into proteins in a process called translation. So that happens in all cells. DNA into RNA happens in all cells. The utilization of energy, right? They all have cells, and every cell has a plasma membrane, blah, blah, blah. So we have cells, heritable material, free energy. This one doesn't talk about evolution, but evolution is the one I forget about every time. And reproduction. So part of reproduction is the inheriting the DNA. So at this point, here's a chart for you, and what I'd really like you to know from this is the things that are the same, the things that are different, focusing on the things that I just talked about, like DNA, circular versus linear, right? Covered with chromosomes, and we covering the chromosomes with histones. So naked versus chromatin. All right, smaller versus larger. Interesting thing about ribosomes, we all have ribosomes, but the ribosomes are different. They're different in compared to 60S, right, are smaller by a little bit. So in prokaryotes, they have a 50S and a 30S ribosomal subunits, the large subunit and the small subunit, whereas in eukaryotes we have slightly larger 60S and 40S. Now, it's interesting, those are the two pieces of, right, so you have a small subunit to your ribosome, and then we also have a large subunit, and when they're taken together, the 50 and 30S for prokaryotes turns into a 70S, which it doesn't add up, I get it. And so the 70S is for prokaryotes when the two are together, and for eukaryotes it's an 80S. So the sizes are slightly different. Right, in the cytoplasm there's not a lot of structures in prokaryotes, whereas we have a lot of membrane-bound organelles. The flagella, which I told you about, right? So in prokaryotes, the flagella is made of a protein called flagellin, which is completely different than the flagella that are made in eukaryotes, which are made of tubulin. And tubulin is the molecule that makes up microtubules. That is going to be important later in the class, but this is another difference. So both prokaryotes and eukaryotes have flagella, but they're made of different proteins. What else is the same and different? Blah, blah, blah. Generally, prokaryotes divide by binary fission, simple division, and that creates clones. Right? So here you have clones, whereas we do meiosis and mitosis, and what that really does is shakes up the gene pool, to be honest, and gives us a lot of variation. Right, so you get some genes from your mom, some genes from your dad, and right, some of those are stronger than others depending on if you have genes that are dominant or recessive, or if there's codependency. Depends on what you get from your mom, what you get from your dad. All right, that's gonna finish this up. So I just want to let you know these are things that you need to know and study, and I'll be providing more of these lectures for you online. Have a great day.